Welcome to the podcast Following Spirit Without Hesitation, stories from journeys of deepening trust. I'm Tania, and this is Christmas week, so I thought I would use this time to share from one of my own stories, which has got many stories contained within it. So I'm not sure if I'll manage to tell the whole story in this episode, or if I'll be breaking it into parts and if there'll be a second part. But we'll soon find out. And I'm telling this story because I feel that it really demonstrates the training that I think we've spoken about in previous episodes, that we're possibly not aware of, things that happen, and then we grow from them, and then we expand, and our capabilities and what we can do, and our trust is deepening. So we are then maybe called into service in other ways. And I feel very blessed with some of the ways that I have been called into service. So this is about what I call my gridwork travels of 2022. And I didn't set out, this was not my plan or my intention, as hopefully that will be demonstrated as that unfolds. But in my previous episodes where I've shared some of my stories, I have spoken about the work that I did around the UK, the sort of the figure of eight work, and that was in effect the preparatory year for doing this. So what had happened is a friend of mine who I knew through my shamanic training, she lives in the Italian Alps, and she's from the indigenous people, descended from the indigenous people of the Italian Alps. And she'd invited me to support her with running a sweat lodge, to help, really bring the sacred back into that ceremony because of what had been happening to it. Italy's got very, very strong, patriarchal structures, especially because, of Rome and the Romans and that whole heritage. So I agreed to that. I thought that would be great. So I planned about sort of 2 or 3 weeks to go over and to do the ceremony and, to have a bit of a holiday. And then a few weeks later, I was speaking to some friends in Switzerland, and, they were telling me about how they were going on this 3-week holiday, but they really needed, somebody with enough gardening knowledge to look after their house and garden. And before I even thought about it, I said, I'll do it. So the sweat lodge ceremony was in May, and their holiday was in July. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have all this time, between the two. I wonder what's going to happen. And I really didn't know. And I'd worked it out, I had a dog, I wanted to bring her with me. And so I needed to go by the Eurotunnel train, which is down in England. So that in itself, from where I live north of Scotland, was a journey in itself, it was sort of 700 miles or so, to be able to get the Eurotunnel over to France, because I didn't want to go by ferry because of the noise and her hearing. And at least, I can drive the car onto the train, and it sounded like a much better idea, and it really is, for those of you who've used it that way. And then, just with the way things are, I could only get like a 3-month, because we're no longer part of the European Union here. So I could only travel for 3 months, and her health check that she needed would only last for 3 months, and then if I came back and went again, I would have to get a second one. So that really committed me to once I go to Europe, I'm going to need to be there for 3 months. And so preparing for that, not having a clue what I was going to be doing. And during that time, I prepared my house, my cottage that I had at the time, to rent it out, because I thought, well, who knows, what's going to happen. So I'd done a lot of packing, and I was sort of organizing things. I have a shipping container here on my land, which is where I'm staying now, and not in the shipping container, on the land. So I had what I called wriggle room. So I started making plans to prepare that to rent out my cottage more full time. But that wasn't really completed in time. So that was the scenario. So I'd made my plans for traveling south to go and get the train when I left. And there were sort of a few overnight stops that I was going to do on the way. And the funny thing was, when I got to my first overnight stop, which was, say, about a 3-hour drive, I got there, and I was traveling in my micro camper, so it's a small van camper. I got there and I realized I'd packed everything. I packed all my ceremonial stuff, everything I needed, my washing stuff, my toiletries. I hadn't brought my clothes. And I knew that was really significant. Okay, it's that sense of, literally having things being stripped away. It really, to have gone back to get them would have been a 6-hour journey, and so the cost of the fuel. And I thought, well, I'm near this small village, good secondhand, or shops as we call them in the UK, thrift stores if you're in the US. And so I thought, I'm as well to spend the money and buy myself some more clothes. Okay, I even had my ceremonial stuff with me. So it was really quite funny that it was really just my clothes. That was the beginning of me starting to understand that this was an initiation, and that the sort of moving into that, and that whole 3 months did end up being really very submersive. Really, I kind of dropped into what I call the magic road for these 3 months, and that sort of quality of doing that work, that quality of energy and that felt sense is very different from my more usual, shall we say, which is of course constantly changing, as it is for everyone, sense of being in the world. But there's a quite distinctive of when I drop into that magic road, that immersive experience of traveling to do this work. And I mean, this was the first time, I guess, that I may have consciously been aware of what I was doing, or at least what I was being called to. And even before I left, I went to visit a particular loch that is very sacred to me, and I believe is very sacred in general. And, the dragons in the mountains were showing themselves. And so I knew that it was, something was happening. And I'd made that connection. And as I was leaving, there was this man who just appeared. And he kind of looked at me, and I said hello, and, and he said, I heard voices. Was that you talking? Now, I hadn't been talking, other than perhaps a little bit to my dog, but I had been having a telepathic communication with the land and the beings of the land. And I knew that he'd picked up on that. And there was a very angelic presence about him. And I just said to him, this is a really, really magical place. And he said, yeah, I can tell. And this is one of the tangents. This often happens. I've had that experience in other places where I've been the visitor and I meet the land guardian of a place, and there's a very ordinary exchange, but at the same time, through that ordinary exchange, there's an invitation as well. And I realized looking back on it, I was giving him that invitation to connect with the magic in the land. So that was one part of before I was leaving. The other part was I connected with this massive dragon. I mean, huge dragon. Her sort of head and nostrils kind of work on the UK. She was under the water, the English Channel, I think it's still called, and all the way across Europe. You know, there's these three mountain ranges. She was huge. And so I had this sense of, oh, I'm going to have to lift her out of the land. Okay. So I didn't know what that entailed or what that meant, but there was this sense of having to free this massive dragon. And another thing that happened was that it was a year of cherry blossom. I mean, it was everywhere before I left. And I made a sacred earth essence called Cherry Blossom. And cherry became a really, really significant part of the journey, you know, all the way through from, you know, flower through to seed, as hopefully you'll see, but a really, really significant, you know, part. And in the sacred earth essence, she's about new beginnings. This is about thresholds. This is about joyful new beginnings. And I'd co-created this essence before I left because it was such a strong energy that was coming through, and also the first cherry tree that had come into blossom here on this land as well. And so it was really potent, this gathering, this accumulating of energy of these different components before I even left. So there I was without any clothes. And so I continued, and I had my route. I thought this was the way I was going. And then I was guided to go a different way. I was guided to go through a place called Pitlochry. And Pitlochry, I'd only been there once before for a training, a Palawa training, which is an energy modality. And I spoke about that in the last episode that I made, where it was just me. And so very often in my experience is there's this framing that happens that where you experience the same energy, and it kind of, you know, both closes a cycle and opens a new cycle. So I knew with what had happened since my last visit to Pitlochry, with going through the time portal and then going to Orkney and what I received in Orkney, and then doing the Figure of Eight journey around the UK, this was a kind of a closing of that, almost, if you like, that foundational training, spirit training. I know that more clearly now than I did at the time. So I had my lunch in Pitlochry. No, I'm getting that mixed up. Pitlochry is where I discovered I lost my clothes. I'd left them behind and bought new clothes. And then I went down to Peebles. That's right, Peebles. Peebles was the Palawa place. Okay, so that's where the closing is. Pitlochry is one of my favourite stopovers when I head south. So I got to Peebles, and then I thought I was going to go, you know, carry on straight, you know, go back onto the route that I'd planned. And this is when Spirit started to, like, no, we're going to guide you. So I was guided to go down this particular road, and it was just like any, an ordinary country road, and I'm sort of really wondering where I'm off to, and I'm sort of talking to Spirit, and Spirit, well, if you're worried, pull over and use Google, at the next stop. So I pulled over at the next stop, at the next place where I could pull over, and it was by a river. So I thought I got out, and there was a sign when I got out, and it said the Holy Grail, and on it was a salmon. Now I'll share links to other things that I've written, blog posts and poems about this journey, because I've never really spoken about it in this way before. I've shared parts of it, and I've written a lot of poetry about it. And I feel that those who resonate with the poetry, it's awakening something, without perhaps giving the direct information, because I was still having to integrate this journey for myself. And so the salmon is an important part of my journey, because of the work that I did with my former husband around salmon farms and the use of pesticides. So that was something that we'd been involved in. So again, this was another closure almost, that though it'd been a long time since that work, the salmon had also had come up again when I went on a vision quest. So that was an important time. So that was another weave. So this also brought in that sense of, that completion since that vision quest as well. So here we are. And so I get my phone out, I look on Google, and there I find, lo and behold, I'm on the road to Holy Island. And I'm like, okay, here we go then. And it was a bit, well, am I going to get there before the tide goes out? And of course, I know well enough to trust Spirit, but the human parts of ourselves still comes in. So off I went. At this time, I kind of knew what the destination was, and went over to Holy Isle and had a really beautiful experience there. There was really strong mermaid energy there, as well as a very sort of protective masculine energy as well, presence too, without going into the details of that, but that's how I felt it. So that night I was sort of camped further down the coast, and I found myself under, at the foot of this massive castle on the beach in the sand dunes, like in my little camper van, and which I later found out is a very prominent feature of a well-known Netflix series about Vikings. So it's funny, how these threads pop up again later. And also it's that thread is something that fed into work or grid work that I was doing later. So it's really curious how things start, but not necessarily complete, if you like, at that time. So from there, I then picked up the road that's known as the A1. And the A1 is known as a Roman road. So already I was on the road to Rome. Okay. And it was like, okay, here we go. So, and then that road continued down. I met up with a friend in the south of England. We did some ceremonial work there, which was, roughly around, it was sort of around Colchester. And again, that was a very strong Roman centre. And also roughly, where the nostrils of this dragon were too. So it felt like, okay, this is where it's starting. So, you know, off I go. I get the train across, and then I'm in Calais, and you know, there I am in my van, and the roads are the other way round. So I'm in a right hand right hand drive vehicle on roads that are suitable for left hand drive. So I very much requested Spirit, much help from Spirit, to guide me on this journey. And I'd booked a campsite just outside Lyon, and and then because it was mainly motorways, it was really quite straightforward and gave me enough time to get used to all of that. But it was dark by the time I got to Lyon, and my guides were again encouraging me not to use Google and to guide me through, and they were going left, right, and I got to a point where they said left, and it was just too late. So I'd pulled over and I'd said to them, you know, I really appreciate the guidance, but I need more warning. Okay, I need more warning. You know, I'm driving this vehicle on roads that it's not really designed to be driven on. I'm driving in a country that I know a little of the language, but I'm not familiar with all of the road signs, you know, and you're encouraging me not to use Google Google Maps. You need to be able to communicate, find a way to communicate to me where I need to turn ahead of time so that I have enough time to prepare myself. So it had this conversation, and then I put on Google Maps and found that lo and behold, I was on the right road, out of Lyon. In fact, pretty much on the outskirts of Lyon. And so it was only about half an hour from the campsite. So that was all well and good, and I think I spent a couple of nights at that campsite just giving ourselves time to adjust, to being in a warmer climate for a start. So that campsite, I hadn't realized, but once I got talking to the people who ran it, because it was a family-run campsite, it intersected onto the Santiago de Compostela network, pilgrimage network. I hope I've got that right. And it was just a real clear sign that here I was on a pilgrimage. You know, it's the second pilgrimage site that I'd been to. Holy Island was one. Here was another one. And actually around that time, there'd been a lot of swan symbolism as well coming up for me, which I've been curious about. So that was my couple of days in Lyon, and then the next leg of the journey was the drive across the Alps to meet my friend. She was going to meet me on the border of Italy, France, in the Alps, and she was finding a route that was best, because there's still, even though it's early May, there's still snow, and one that, you know, avoided too many sort of toll roads, motorways, and so on. So that was the next part of the journey. So my next stop was Grenoble, which was also interesting, more sort of swan energy, and I didn't spend long there. It was more just passing through to have some lunch, pick up some food, and so on, and then just continue on. And this is really where I pick up the route to go over the Alps. And one of the things that I really loved about that journey is I've spent a long time, again, I've got I've written about this, you know, working with my voice. I had a lot of inhibitions around talking and therefore learning other languages. And for me, one of the beautiful things about this journey was that inhibition was no longer there. And I had some lovely conversations with people where neither of us spoke the same language, but we managed to communicate because I wasn't inhibited. I would just say what I said and use the bits of language that I knew, and was happy to use sign language and play things out. And so it was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed that. So when I met my friends on the border, the first thing she said to me was, "Did you know that was the Magdalene way?" And I was like, okay. Now, I'm on a shamanic path. And at the time, you know, really I wasn't engaged in that. You know, that for me was a priestess path. I didn't feel that I was on a priestess path. And so I didn't really have any interest, I guess, if you like, in exploring that knowledge, because I was on a shamanic path. Because now I see the just how interwoven all of that is. And I feel very much that one of the reasons I was able to do this journey was because I had no expectations or information. I hadn't read any books, or I hadn't engaged in any of the sort of Magdalene lineage teachings. I was really, because it wasn't my thing, if you like. So that was curious. It was just a wooden sign that said that. And of course, the pilgrimage routes, the Santiago de Compostela, which I believe is the town rather than the pilgrimage route, but I'm sure most of you know what I mean. It's a network. It's a network of pilgrimage paths throughout Europe, through much of Europe. I don't know the details of it, but this is what I kept intersecting with, and I believe this is perhaps what the Magdalene Way was. It was one of those paths, one of those pilgrimage paths. And as I say, it wasn't something I was looking for. I just knew that I was going to be going to my friends to help facilitate this sweat lodge, and then do something until I went to Switzerland to house sit for my other friends. I just knew that something was going to unfold. And of course, I was gathering all of this information. The swan energy had also been strong in Grenoble. And yet it didn't continue past that. And so there I am in Italy. I speak even less Italian than I speak French. And you know, staying in this really beautiful place in the Alps, and I really, yeah, had a really wonderful, interesting time. But then again, you know, this is where, you know, spirit starts to show me some information. So I had time. There were things that I needed to do to prepare for the sweat lodge. There were things about the sites that weren't ideal that that I was being guided of what to do. One of them was to gather some willow. For those of you who don't know, the sweat lodge is made out of what we would call a bendy tent. So it's made out of branches that are bent to make the shape, and then it's covered with sort of blankets or animal skins, if there's animal skins, so it's completely dark when people go inside. And this one had been made out of hazel, and it just felt very masculine again. So I'd been guided to go and get some willow, and my friends were saying, "You're not going to find any willow around here," but off I went and found the willow. down by this river, which there's a whole other story about that river, a very special river. And found the willow. And this is the first time that I ever realized with willow, you know, it was 30 plus degrees, even at that time of year. It was hot. And I'd found this willow, I'd gone down and I was underneath it, and it was raining. And I had never realized the reason weeping willow is called weeping willow is because literally that water, you know, drips out of the leaves. I guess I've never been anywhere that's really dry enough where there's no, you know, anywhere else you can account for that happening, right? Especially in Scotland. And so here I was being blessed by this willow, and got the willow poles that I needed for that ceremony. Then the next thing, really, where we were staying, there was a hunter who'd come in nearby and was telling us, you know, there's some wolves. The wolves are starting to sort of spread sort of south in Europe. So it's quite exciting, really. But there was a pack of wolves that were kind of moving around the area. And there's a lot of wild pigs as well, or wild boar. And, you know, my dog was getting quite distressed by this because of where it was and the valley through to where the next village was and the sounds, and she couldn't orientate herself to the sounds. She was finding it really unsettling, you know, especially at night. So she wasn't sleeping because she wasn't sleeping, I wasn't sleeping, and it was like, okay, so I'm going to need to go and stay somewhere else. And so I found somewhere which I thought was just a short way away, you know. It was about half an hour, 45 minutes away, which wasn't too bad, really, considering it's the rural Alps. And I ended up in this beautiful place, place of such light. It was palpable, absolutely. It was just amazing. And there was a monastery, a nunnery monastery there that was called the Order of the White Rose. Remember what I was saying about I'm not on a priestess path, right? And I'm like, of course, in Italian, I know enough Italian to be able to translate Blanca Rosa. Blanco, isn't it? Anyhow. And also there was a statue of Saint Lucia, who is the saint of the light as well, there as well as stuff in dedication to Mussolini, along a promenade somewhere too, which was it's quite interesting, you know, that juxtaposition. But there was still so much light there, and so here I was in this light bubble. When I told my friend where I'd ended up, it was where her grandmother, who owns the place where she was living, after her grandfather died, her grandmother had then gone to stay with the nuns, like for her last years. And so there was this beautiful, I feel like saying osmosis of, you know, this is leading up to sweat lodge ceremony. So of course, you know, these synchronicities are going to start to happen. But there was also, you know, a bigger pattern that was unfolding. You know, if you think the willow, which represents the feminine, with that hazel that felt so masculine, there's this sort of masculine and feminine energies. Then you have, you know, Mary Magdalene, and then the Order of the White Rose. Then you have Saint Lucia. So, and the other name that started coming up at this point was Sophia. So my friend had sent me to a place where the Cathar persecution started. Whether it had started in Italy or just in Europe in general, but it was where the persecution had started. So she'd sent me to this place. And that's when Sophia, the name Sophia, started coming up a lot. The Great Mother, the Divine Mother, is very often known as Sophia. So, and of course I'm taking note of all of this. And there was also that river that I mentioned earlier. It's a sort of masculine and feminine river. There's two parts that sort of flow into each other. And so it is this sort of amazing energy from this river. And so I was exploring that area, and again following the guidance and I was in this particular village, and I started being called, don't forget me, sister. I'm getting chills just saying that. Don't forget me, sister. And I'm like, where are you? Where are you? And it took me a while, because I'm looking around, there's big church there, and there's sort of various other things within this particular, it's quite a relatively big village. And I'm looking, and she kept calling me, don't forget me, sister, don't forget me, sister. And in the end, I ended up parking next to like a baseball pitch or some sort of sports ground, that was sort of fenced off. And I was like wondering, because sometimes, I'm not perfect. I still like get stress responses about, well, I'm listening, but I'm not finding you, And of course, when I'd first driven down that particular road, I thought, well, this doesn't look as if there's anything here. But when I went back and parked up and thought, I'll just take a breather, come back to myself, I noticed a hiking sign just across the road. And I thought, okay, let's go down there. I'll add something else. Before I left that morning, before I left my friends, that her neighbour's 8-year-old granddaughter had given me a bunch of flowers, the flowers that are called Star of Bethlehem. Now, I've never seen Star of Bethlehem before. I'm familiar with them through the Bach Flower Remedies, and it's for trauma. But of course, Star of Bethlehem, we all know what that represents, and all of the sort of the spiritual mysticism around the meaning of that. Another Holy Grail, if you like. Okay. So I had this little bunch of flowers, and so I took them with me, and I followed this trail, and then behind, there's this sort of scrubby woodland, relatively ill kept. I mean, or left to go wild, shall we say, and ivy. And then there was this building there, and it was a well, and within the well was a shrine to Mother Mary. So here we've gone from Mary Magdalene to Mother Mary. And there's this well, and it's been forgotten about, really. And you could tell from all of the dust that nobody had really brought any offerings for a long time, because a lot of shrines, especially in a place like Italy, they're well used. And it was really poignant. So I did the work as I was guided to, sort of a very simple ceremony, and had some, I think it was a rose quartz crystal to offer the water, and I left the Star of Bethlehem for Mother Mary. But there's something more here. And then the next message was, go down to the river. Go down to the river. And so I then because obviously the well is connected to the river, it's connected to the water. And if you think of water and water being consciousness and emotions, but also the feminine, okay, the feminine energy. So I tried to get down to the water and I couldn't because it was fenced off, so a little bit like there was a grid as well over this well, so there was no access to it, though I was able to drop my crystal through the grid, but people weren't able to get any water from the well. It wasn't in use for that any longer. And so it was fenced off, and it was a hazel plantation for a well-known chocolate company, which I don't eat anymore. I really used to enjoy them, but I can't anymore. That uses hazelnuts a lot. And I couldn't get access to the river. I mean, this was something that was completely new to me. I hadn't been aware of hazel plantations, and this was a plantation. It wasn't like that. I think there were a lot of like local farmers or sort of small scale farmers who grew hazels and sold them. They weren't fenced off in the same way. This was like a commercial plantation, and so it took me ages. There was no way I was going to manage to sort of climb one of the fences. I would have done if I could have found a part that was accessible. And I guess this is why I'm called to do that work, because I'm the sort of person who would climb a fence, right? If that was the only option. I have no problem with that. The divine, all in divine service, right? So it makes sense of perhaps some of my younger escapades of being anti-establishment. Anyhow, so I did actually manage to find access to the river, and it was where there was a bridge. I feel, if I remember this rightly, there was a bridge, and I was able, and the fencing must have had stopped, or it had become run down because other people were getting access through that, because they were also, whether it's sort of local youth or people. So I was able to get down to the river. I finally found a place, but it took a lot. It took me a good hour to find access to the river, and I did. And I as I sat with the river, I could really feel this strong, very strong serpentine energy. It was really, really clear, this serpentine energy, and we're working with that and releasing this serpentine energy. So that serpentine energy, which is representative again of the feminine, right? The feminine energy that had been suppressed, that fear, that whole sense of being fear of snakes and fear of the dark, and that part. So we released that serpentine energy in that piece of work there. And there were other things. I mean, everything, like I say, this was such an immersive, everything kind of fed in. So I'm just trying to stick to the key points, okay? And when it came to the day of running the sweat lodge ceremony, with some really beautiful people, one couple brought some serpentine rock, and they'd found it by the side of the road, as there'd been I think they were explaining they're making a new road, so there'd been some sort of dynamite blast perhaps, or something like that. And they'd found this serpentine rock, and so they brought serpentine rocks. So, and I'm getting chills again talking about this. So we had brought the serpentine rock into the sweat lodge, and that was part of that energy that yet again with the water, because with sweat lodge the stones are put into the fire that helps to support with that release of the energy. And then they're brought, that's from the masculine energy that's brought then into the feminine energy, and the water is poured over them. And so the energy of the stones sacrifice themselves for us. So that energy is then contributes to the prayers and the ceremony. So here we are, releasing, just reinforcing that, the work of releasing that serpentine energy, which was really beautiful. So a lot more happened. I'm trying to stick to the key points, and I haven't prepared for this. It's been really interesting since I've thought about doing this. I've felt like it's almost like the files are opening up in my consciousness, though I may weave back and forth a bit. So at this point, after the sweat lodge and that, I was going to visit my friends in Switzerland to just get check in with the house and see things. And I didn't really know where I was going next. But at that time, because of my plan with my house, I was thinking, well, I need to go back to Scotland. And of course, the original plan had been to leave my dog with my friend in Italy, but it wasn't suitable because she found it too stressful to be there, especially overnight. So, I'd been wondering around, okay, well, how am I going to deal with that? I need to go back to Scotland for a week to sort out the things that I need to sort out there. So I'd sort of put that up to the universe. And before I left Italy to go to Switzerland, a friend of mine from Austria got in touch to, just, hi, how are you? And I'm like, oh, Austria's next to Switzerland, isn't it? I said, and she lived with me for 3 months when she came to visit in Scotland, and she came for a week, and I ended up saying to her, we got on so well. I said to her, you can stay for as long as you like, and I think she stayed for about 3 months, but she helped me with Pippa and other things, and we had a really lovely time. So I'd said to her, could you look after Pippa while I go back to Scotland for a week or, 10 days, with traveling either side? And she said, yeah, no problem. She said, and I can find some place for you to leave your van as well. Which was like, yay, this is amazing. So, so off I go to Switzerland and to meet my friends there. And there were various things that happened on that journey. As I say, it was a really strong immersive, it just through the traveling through the Alps. And this is when the white stag started to appear, as well as the dragons. And I'm really trying to tune into sort of the order of things, but I feel called for the dragons first. And again, a little bit like with the Marys, the dragon energy, something I was familiar with, but not something that I'd become immersed in. I was familiar with it in as much as I worked with dragons in the same way I worked with my power animals, because I'm on a shamanic path, and I was aware of their energy and their power and that. But it was a relatively new relationship. I was aware that I was of a dragon lineage at that point, though. I had been an experience not long before I left. I think just the February before, I'd had some really intense inner initiatory experiences, which are a whole other story. And I guess not relevant to this podcast, to the theme of following spirit, right? So, and again, I loved how sort of spirit started to work through Google. And back to that. So if you remember, I asked Spirit to let me know, okay, let me know when I need to turn, find a way. And what started to happen is there'd be a crow. Every time I needed to take a turn or go in a specific direction, a crow would be there. They'd be sat on top of the signpost, they'd be or by the side of the road or wherever it was convenient, but there would always be a crow everywhere. And even if I knew I needed to take that turning, which was the confirmation, the crow would be there. And that happened throughout the whole of the journey, the rest of my time in Europe. And it still happens from time to time now, as if to sort of remind me, a little cheeky reminder. So, and Spirit also works through Google, because I'd be thinking I'm going down on one route and then suddenly the route would change. And I'm like, it wasn't like that a minute ago. So I thought I was going to go one way through the Alps. I ended up going through another. And in one place, one of the things that happened was I'd got to this. So I'm still in the Italian Alps. I hadn't quite got to the Swiss Alps at that point. I'd stopped. No, I was on this road and there was this traffic jam. And there's this sort of, these huge mountain ranges, and it was like this intersection of these three particular mountains, and there's this traffic, and there's a tiny village. So this roundabout was just really a road to go down to this village, and then it's straight on, and it was like, why is there a traffic jam? And I ended up on the roundabout for 45 minutes. So I'm kind of halfway around the roundabout for 45 minutes. But during that 45 minutes, I'm releasing dragons. I'm dropped into this space and we are releasing these dragons from the different ways that they've been trapped. And it was almost like, I describe it as a nest. It wasn't a nest. It's almost like a place where they'd all been put in together, and different ways of them being bound and trapped and that. So we released, during that 45 minutes was spent releasing these dragons from that bondage. And then as soon as the work was finished, the road cleared. And when I went down the road, there was sort of just police, and they'd just, for whatever reason, they'd put barriers down. There was no obvious reason why they did that. Couldn't see that anybody had been arrested or anything like that. Didn't seem like there'd been any accident. So who knows why they blocked off that road, but clearly it was needed for me so that I could do that specific bit of grid work on that roundabout by this remote village, right? So, and a few other things like that happened. And it was at the borders, I think, roundabout moving into Switzerland. I'm trying to think if I've got this right. No, it was Switzerland to Austria that the white stag started to appear, but it was starting to appear a bit before that. So Switzerland was, I found, really dense. There was some really dense work. Another one that I seem to work with a lot is World War II. So there was things around World War II that I don't particularly want to talk about that I was called to clear. And then again, traveling through Zurich, there was another snarl up of traffic, and it's also clearing the density in general. So it was that I found that very heavy work. And it was quite funny because more recently, when I said to my guides, I don't want to do any more work on World War II. This was not 2022, which is the year I'm talking about, but it was more recently. And then I'm suddenly in the middle of the Somme battlefield and doing clearing for World War I, and I'm like, okay, thanks. Anyhow, back to that time. I got to my friends, and and they showed me around the area, and there was some really curious connections there, which I will come back to when I come back to Switzerland. Okay, so so after that, the next trip was to go to Austria. I'd I'd been called to sort of book my flights, and it was really strange flights. I kind of work with, with the principle, I know with Thich Nhat Hanh and his community, when they travel, they always take the cheapest flight, even if it's a penny difference and 15 hours. And I'm not quite that dedicated. I kind of find a balance. If there's a penny difference, I'm going to take the faster one. Okay, but that's their ethos that they stick to. But both flights, it was really interesting. Like both going back to Scotland and then going back to Austria, were kind of hopping around Europe, like taking me to Romania and to Germany, and each one had were about 3 stops. But that was the route Spirit wanted me to take. So I'd booked that, and at that point, because it was shortly after the pandemic, Austria, you still had to take a COVID test before going into Austria, and the rules changed 2 days before I went to Austria. It was something ridiculously close like that. So I didn't have to take a COVID test when I got to Austria. And again, this travel, I'm taken to places like to this beautiful portal by the side of a motorway. These one village that was such incredible density, and I remember saying to my guides, I'm like, I can't stay here. And this is when they said to me, you're an acupuncture needle, Tania. You just need to be here long enough to give us access so that we can come in and do that work. And that was the first time that I really understood that. Sometimes I need to be more physically engaged with that, but in some instances I don't. And I'm sure that's very similar for other people, those of you who do this work as well. And that was a relief. This place, there's quite a few like that. This place was called St. Michael. So I'm thinking, and it wasn't at all. It was, and so there were these pockets of doing this work along the way, but I particularly remember that portal by the side of the motorway, just some random place I was told to pull over. And there were grasses growing there that I have never, ever seen anywhere else. Just really beautiful grasses. And I'm familiar enough with grasses and sedges and the different, sort of like, if you like, meadow flowers, but absolutely, these places are hidden, there might be all of these places, the sort of sacred sites that might be visited and that we go to and sort of honor in a sort of memory or our ancestors in whatever way that we do. But there are other places that are hidden, that are unknown, that you wouldn't even dream existed. And they're there. They're just not known. And this is part of what I was being shown. I was being shown a lot of that. Here I was picking up on these different pilgrimage routes throughout Europe. And that's as I started to realize that's what was happening. And the other thing, getting a little bit carried away and ahead of myself, and I know I'm weaving back and forth, But, you know, obviously I'm talking about this over, you know, it's been over 3 years since that journey. So I understand a lot more about it now than I did at the time. Another thing that was happening was that thunderstorms were following me. You know, nearly everywhere that I went and this work was done, there would be a thunderstorm. So there would be this clearing that would happen after doing this work. And it's really humbling to sort of realize that this work that I'm doing as part of this team, unseen team, it can have that kind of impact, you know. I'm just there with my dog driving my micro camper across Europe. So here I am in Austria, which was quite an interesting time in various things that happened. But I got to my friends, and from there, we had some time together as well, which was really lovely. And I did my plane jump all the way back to Scotland. And what was happening is a lot of these places where I was doing the transfers were small airports. And in each of those airports, there was work to be done. That was maybe not specifically around that airport, but energetic work to be done that was part of the wider area. And so that was also interesting. And not only that, it was also the people I sat next to on the planes, the conversations that I had, and just some really beautiful, unexpected encounters. One woman I met, and we got talking, and I mean, it was just because we were sat side by side, and it was a 3-seater plane, and there was nobody on the outside. And I just turned to her to say, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to move. So we've both got a bit more space. And I never ended up moving. We ended up talking, and she had a Scottish boyfriend. She was Romanian, and we had this beautiful conversation, and talking. And then about less than a year later, she sent me this photograph to say, look, I've handed in my resignation. And it was just like, yay, because I was talking to her about following your heart and following spirit. And so it was just so lovely. Anyhow, so then I go back to Scotland, and I kind of get back to Scotland, and I'm thinking, what am I doing back here? It seemed so important that I needed to come back here, and I'm back here now, and I'm starting to think, I don't need to be back here. And it was really curious. And again, with hindsight, I realized that I needed to anchor into the land and almost have that exchange of information, because when we're doing this work, we're carrying it within our energetic field. And I think, this is the importance of those of us who do the work in the physical. It is needed to be done in the physical. Like being that acupuncture needle, because we help to pierce the veil between the physical and the energetic. And, we can do the work remotely, but it's very, very different. And I've done both. It's very, very different. I spoke in a previous episode where I'd done some work with Glastonbury. It come up in client work, but it then extended into land work from that. And, I'd been told to go to Glastonbury to anchor it in. So, it is needed. And I think this is why when I talk about my unseen teams, it's also those of us as light workers and grid workers, or whatever we like to label ourselves as, are part of these teams. I'm under no illusions that it's just me doing that work, right? I'm part of a team, an unseen team, but also a human team. Other people who've traveled to these places, maybe not some of the places that I ended up in, but but to some of these sort of key places on the grids to really do that energetic support. And I understand that better than I did then, because I was very much just being led by spirit. So there I am back in Scotland, anchoring that in. There's another interesting part of that story, and this is why I can try and say, oh well, that was 2022, but it's also connected to other work, and I can see the beginnings of, in hindsight, telling this story, I can see how the work in 24 and 23 and 25 all unfolded from that return to Scotland, from having been in France and Italy. And I am going to stop there. There really is going to be a part 2. I don't know how long I've been talking for. I've really enjoyed sharing this story, because I've never really shared it like this before. I've shared fragments of it with certain people, and like I say, through some of my posts, which are now on blog posts. I'm moving most of them off social media, and a lot through my poetry. It's all there in my poetry. So yeah. So for part 2, and maybe there'll be a few other parts too. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful 2026. It's going to be so exciting, and sending you much love from my heart to yours.